Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition, we spotlight the life and legacy of Hajj Malik Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X. And we're joined by a very special guest. He is a distinguished lecturer, award-winning journalist, author, activist, and one of the founding members of the Organization of African American Unity. And also, he is a writer of 3 works on the life of Hajj Malik Shabazz. One of the works is entitled Witnessing Brother Malcolm X, the Master Teacher, Seventh Child, a family memoir of Malcolm X with Rodnell P. Collins, the nephew of Malcolm X, as well as Malcolm X, the Man and His Times, from 1968 to 1975, which was edited by the great John Henry Clark. Let's welcome Professor A. Peter Bailey to Cultural Caravan. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you very much.
You know, one of the things that I really thank you for joining us, because over the years there's been many conversations as it relates to our Supreme Teacher, Master Teacher, and Pan-Africanist, known as Malcolm X and later Hajj Malik Shabazz. But one of the things that I think people don't focus on is what his next step in his journey was, in relation to his development as an intellectual and an internationalist. Could you please, first of all, tell us about how did you meet Malcolm X or Hajj Malik Shabazz?
Okay. I moved to Harlem in the summer of 1962. On a Friday night. I remember it was a Friday night. That Saturday morning, my roommate and I decided, rather than, unpacking and that kind of thing, that we were going to walk around, because he had never been to Harlem and I had never been to Harlem. Let's put it this way. I'd been to Harlem, but it just barely, because my attitude about Harlem was, had originally been like, this is a place, that you can get yourself killed if you're walking down the streets, because I'd read all those horror stories and found out that it was not true when I moved there. But on that Saturday morning, we went on Friday night, that Saturday morning, we decided to walk down Lenox Avenue, now Malcolm X Boulevard, 142nd Street down to 116th Street. We were just walking down. We weren't heading to 116th Street. We were just walking that way, looking. And we got down to the 116th Street area, and we saw a crowd gathering. And so we said, people, what's going on? And they said, Malcolm X is going to speak. Now, at that time, I had kind of vaguely heard of him, the horror stories, oh, he was this and he was that, and he believed in violence, and he was going to kill all white people, that kind of bad thing. but that was vaguely. So we said, let's see what he's got to say. And he spoke for 3 hours. And by the time he was finished, I was a Malcolmite. I had never heard anyone talk about race in this country with such clarity and knowledge and charisma and whatever it was. I mean, the brother was really made things clear. And two things specifically have stood out to me to this very day. One, he said that we often are given the impression that white supremacy is just in the former Confederate States of America. He said white supremacy is the dominant political belief throughout this entire country with varying degrees of intensity, but that no such thing as it is just being down, down south, quote unquote. And of course, now that I'd kind of vaguely heard before, but the second thing he talked about that afternoon, I had never heard before, and he talked about attacks on the mind. And I had never heard anyone talk about the absolute destructiveness of attacks on the mind. And as he talked, I began to remember growing up in Tuskegee, Alabama, and going downtown to the segregated movie theaters. In Tuskegee, we were lucky in the sense that black people didn't have to sit in the balcony. They had two completely separate theaters side by side. White people went in one, black people in the other. And I must say, I gotta say, they kept the black one up. It was not like it was ragged or anything like that. But every Saturday, you see a whole theater full of black kids, a movie theater full of black kids my age, between ages of about 6 and 13. And Saturday after Saturday, year after year, we would go down to town to that movie theater. And many, many of the movies they showed were Tarzan movies. And we would sit there in that segregated movie theater in a white supremacist society and cheer for Tarzan and Cheetah over the Africans. And as when Brother Malcolm talked about the mind, attacks on the mind, I began to realize that that's what had been done to us. It was the first time I ever thought about that. I never, it's just a movie. So that's those two things, and I became an instant supporter. And so I was not, at that time, I was just kind of breaking away from Christianity. I was raised as a Christian, and I was not prepared to go into another religion. So I never had any intention of joining the Nation of Islam. So what would happen is that wherever he spoke in the New York City area, I would make sure I was there. I would be there, and listen. But I was not going to join the Nation of Islam. And then I think it was around early December 1963, when that whole thing first broke about the the conflict between him and the Nation of Islam. I had a friend. She worked at that time. I'm working at Time Inc., which is right across the street from what the building that the Ebony magazine eventually became in. And I was an editorial reference clerk. I had to read the newspapers every day and take out names in the newspapers, take calls from reporters for people, for folders unnamed. And she was into NBC at that time, was just beginning to take on, black interns. So she was an intern at NBC. And down below, they had, these restaurants and things. So that's where we met. We'd sit down there and we'd talk and have lunch and talk about different things. And one day, and she was a very nice sister and everything. And one day she said, would you like to be a part of the founding of a black nationalist organization? Well, I said, what? I said to myself now, I didn't say it to her. Because I never thought of her, quote unquote, as a black nationalist. She looked more like the AKA type. She called me Saturday morning. I went to the place. It was a motel in Harlem up there around 153rd Street and 8th Avenue. And I was a little bit shocked because that place had a reputation of being one of those places you could check in for 2 hours. And I was a little bit shocked that we were going to be meeting there, but I went, and there was a ground level conference room. You walk into this conference room. And there were about maybe a dozen people there when I came in, including my friend and her roommate, and Dr. John Henry Clark, who I did not know, but I recognized him, and John Oliver Killens, the author. And the other people, I had seen them, I knew of them, but I didn't know them. And after I'd been there maybe about, we were sitting around talking, after I'd been there maybe about 15 or 20 minutes, in walks Brother Malcolm. And it was only when he walked through that door that I realized I was going to be a part of an organization with Brother Malcolm. It really almost knocked me off my seat. And he came in, introduced himself, and then he had each one of us introduce ourselves, and that's when we began to form the organization. That was the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And he told us that was going to be the name because it was being taken from the Organization of African Unity.
Now, you mentioned that there were 2 organizations that Brother Malcolm formed. Tell us about
Well, the first organization he formed after leaving the nation was Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Those were the people who were Muslims, who were supporting him, from a religious perspective. And then, of course, the Organization of Afro-American Unity was set up for people such as myself, who tremendously admired him and wanted to be a part of what he was doing, but who were not going to become Muslims. So that's what the OEAU was set up for. And these two, now some people, of course, there were some people in the MMI who were also in the OAAU. But the OAAU people were not basically in MMI.
So what was, as a member, what were some of the objectives? First of all, what inspired Brother Malcolm, Hajj Malik Shabazz, to found this organization? And certainly, what were some of the goals that you recall?
Well, I later found a speech that Brother Malcolm made in December of 1964 to some young people who had come up from SNCC, had sent them up from Mississippi to meet with him in Harlem in the Hotel Teresa, which is where eventually became where our office was. And he had said to those young people that this country has never in its history done anything in terms of, forward racially, unless pressure from the outside. It had never voluntarily done, quote unquote, the right thing. So, and the OAAU was set up to become an international organization and use that whole thing that, as a means of putting pressure. Now you have to think this is 1955, 1965, the height of the so-called Cold War and with Russia and the United States. And of course the Russians were using this against the United States on an international level. And so Brother Malcolm saw an opportunity to use this and become, use the internationalizing of the movement. And that's why our organization, from the very beginning, we called it a human rights organization, not a civil rights organization, because human rights is the international term. There's a UN Commission on Human Rights. So from the very beginning, we had an international thrust and identity.
Tell us about the influence, the impact of Malcolm's trip to the Motherland.
Okay. Brother Malcolm, of course, part of the internationalizing was, his goal was to take the United States government before the UN Commission on Human Rights for being either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of Black people. And you have to know the amount of things that were going on at that time. There was a lot of terroristic things going on during that time, 1955, 1965. And so, of course, part of this was, in order to do this, and by the way, the United States to this day has never signed the UN Charter on Human Rights. Because from what I understand, if they sign it, then a local organization can go to the UN. If they don't sign it, then you have to get a UN member to take the case before the UN Commission on Human Rights, which was the situation. So Brother Malcolm, of course, he was working on developing relationship with the African countries and getting them to agree to take our case to the UN Commission on Human Rights. In May 1964, I think it was, he went to Africa. He took several trips, but I remember specifically talking about this one because it was during that trip that he had audiences. And now remember, I'm not meet you at a reception, you say hello, you shake hands, you might talk, and then you move on. No, he had audiences ranging from an hour and a half to 3 hours with President Nasser of Egypt, President Ezekwe of Nigeria, President Nkrumah of Ghana, President Kenyatta of Kenya, President Toure of Guinea, President Nyerere of Tanzania, and Prime Minister Obote of Uganda. He had audiences with them. And I'm trying to figure, just imagine what Edgar Hoover at the CIA, they thought when this brother sat down there and had order with these on that level, they treated it almost like he was a Secretary of State or Foreign Minister for black people out. So that's what it was. He understood. He knew that they had to, and and Brother Malcolm had a way of explaining things that whether you were a PhD or a high school, you could understand. And he said that the reason he was urging this move towards Africa for us, he said that when he was a child growing up, he remembered hearing people say, "You don't have a Chinaman's chance." And that meant that whatever you were doing, there was no way it was going to be able to be done. You don't have a Chinaman's chance. He said, notice they don't say that no more since China became a force on the world scene. You don't hear that no more. He said, well, Africa can be the same kind of thing, protection for people of African descent around the world. So, a strong Africa is absolutely vital to black folks everywhere. And of course, the relationship between Africans on the continent and people of African descent in North America is extremely important.
You had a Malcolm X, an African American, going to Africa, forming these strong alliances, gaining lots of influence amongst African people on the continent, as well as his his recognition and his credibility amongst those here. And obviously, people looked at him as a potential threat.
Oh yes, it was. And by the way, it was before then. This British writer named Anthony Summers, he wrote a book in the early 1900s called Official and Confidential: The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover. Now, this is a big book, almost 500 pages. There's one mention of Brother Malcolm in the book, but it's extremely important. In this, there's a page in the book where he says that J. Edgar Hoover, in a luncheon meeting with then Senator Lyndon Johnson. Now, if it was Senator Lyndon Johnson, it had to be before 1960, because Johnson became vice president in 1960. So this means that and at this luncheon meeting, Hoover said to Johnson, quote, "We wouldn't have any problem if we get those two guys fighting and we could get them to kill one another off," end of quote. Those two guys were Brother Malcolm and Dr. King. So it was obvious that even before 1960, he was already watching these two brothers and was concerned about their possibilities. So of course, when Brother Malcolm started moving on and forming the OEAU with this express, the goal of establishing this relationship with Africa, and it's that got strictly on the nerves of the State Department and J. Edgar Hoover and those boys.
And also, you touched upon that relationship between Brother Malcolm and Dr. King, that, people, they did respect one another.
They respected one another. They did not have, you can't really call it a relationship per se. But there's that famous picture of them together. That was one picture, and I think they were together maybe a minute, because they were both rushing to airplanes and they saw each other, they shook hands, and then it was gone. But I found out later that there were people in Brother Malcolm's movement and people in Dr. King who were having quiet meetings with the idea of eventually bringing these two brothers, to meet together. Now, I'm not going to say they ever would have been homeboys, but I think they were both committed. They were both committed to us, and it is obvious that the Edgar Hoover feared any type of growing relationship between these two. It was obvious. And then of course Brother Malcolm, when Dr. King was arrested in Selma, they were really fearful that they might try to kill him when he was in jail in Selma. So they sent out a word national. They wanted black folks with national reputations to come to Selma to keep a press thing on that whole situation, so to make it more difficult for them to do something to Dr. King. Brother Malcolm at the time was speaking in Tuskegee at the university, which is, by the way, is my home. And I was proud when I heard that Tuskegee had invited him to speak. It, I was never think that little, university down there, that little town there, would have had the nerve to invite, Malcolm X down to speak, But that's why he'd given a lecture there when he heard about this call. So he went to Selma. And a couple of years ago, when I finally met a brother who was a part of Dr. King's inner circle, and he told me, he said, "Man, when we heard Malcolm X was coming to Selma, we didn't know what to do. We were worried. We were worried about what he was going to say, and whether he would." But he said, we finally decided that it would be more costly to not let him come than to let him come. So Brother Malcolm went to Selma. The authorities would not allow him to see Dr. King. He did meet with Mrs. King, but they would not allow him to see Dr. King. But he did speak at Brown's Chapel, which was the headquarters for the whole SCLC operations in Selma. He spoke that evening, and a lot of his speech that evening focused on what he was doing internationally and why it was so important. And he basically was saying that the type of thing that happened to Dr. King and that had happened in Selma, the Bloody Sunday, was just the kind of thing that needed to be spread internationally to put pressure on the federal government to move, because he said they never would move without outside pressure.
What were some of the events that you had the opportunity to attend, and what was the impressions that he made amongst our people here as well as our people on the continent?
Well, mainly we didn't really, on a very real level, Brother Malcolm spent during the last 15 months of his life, including it with the OAAU, he was traveling most of the time. So the OAAU, we didn't really get a chance to do a whole lot of stuff. I mean, we put out a newsletter. I was the editor of the newsletter. That was my introduction to journalism. I was the editor of the newsletter, and I can remember.
What was the name of the newsletter?
The first issue was called the OAAU newsletter, and there began to be a lot of talk about a white backlash to the movement. So we started calling the newsletter the Blacklash, the OAAU Blacklash, and we printed a total of 9 issues, and the last 6 issues had the name the OAAU Blacklash. And it was also with that I learned, because I had already been introduced to Brother Malcolm as a master teacher, but to show how the broad knowledge he had. In the very first newsletter, I wrote an article about the uprising in Harlem in 1964, when that policeman killed that 15-year-old boy, and Harlem, had led to an uprising in Harlem. Now, Brother Malcolm at the time was in Africa, carried out, his international goal. But of course, newspapers in New York were saying that he was at some hidden hideaway over in Queens directing this uprising. They were literally saying that in New York City, and so, but he would call back to the office and get information from people who had various responsibilities about what was going on in that particular. So when it was my turn, I had written my first article. I had interviewed young people who had been there when this young boy had been killed, and I had gone over there and talked to them and interviewed them. And I wrote my first journalistic article was about that. And when it was my turn to speak with Brother Malcolm, I was reading him what I had written, and I said, "Eyewitnesses to the murder." And he stopped me, and he said, "Brother Peter, you can't use the word murder. Murder are legal terms that you can only use once the person has been convicted. And we know he's not going to be convicted, And if you call him a murderer or murderer before then he can, when he's acquitted, he can sue you for defamation." He said, "Call him a killer and refer to it as a killing, because he's a killer, and it's a killing no matter what the circumstances." And again, the master teacher, because sure enough, when that officer was acquitted, he sued Martin Luther King's organization and CORE for putting out flyers calling him a murderer. But because of Brother Malcolm's knowledge about how the legal system worked, we avoided that because of him knowing that. And I remember on February 21st, 1965, the day he was assassinated, he said to us, those 5 of us who were backstage with him, that he was going to take a speaking engagement down in Jackson, Mississippi. For the first time, he was going to go down and speak in Mississippi. And then when he came back, he was going to spend the next 6 months building up the OAAU. And of course, that's the same day he was assassinated. But because he was an organizer. I mean, he's the reason that the Nation of Islam became the organization that it became. because the brother was an organizer. You know, he knew how to put things in order and keep things going, and you know, so, and I'm sure that had he been, you know, able to, had not been assassinated, the OAU would have become a serious organization.
Let's talk about, as you know, this year happens to be a major election, 2020, and you know, a lot of people refer to Brother Malcolm's position on the elections and the Black agenda. Talk to us about his position for those who are not familiar with in terms of the Black.
Brother Malcolm's position that Black folks in this country should form an independent political party. He did not believe in any, you know, in being either in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, because he said that neither one of them had, the Black folks voted mainly Republican from 1867 to 1936. And since 1936, most of the time, they voted with the Democrats. He said neither party has us at the top of its agenda, not even probably in the top 10 on its agenda. So what we should do is form an independent political party, and on any given issue, if on this issue the Republicans, we're close to what they're close to what we do, then vote for them. If they're different, the Democrats, do it like that. Be really independent. Do not be a part of either one of those parties, because neither one had us top end. So he would be, when it came to voting, I remember in 1960, you know, when Goldwater was running against Lyndon Johnson, his thing was that, you know, sometimes it's easier to deal with Goldwater, the wolf, than Johnson, the fox. He said, because the wolf, you always on alert, because, you know, the wolf will get you. You know, so you always on the alert when you're dealing with the wolf. Sometimes the fox can soothe you, or because they slick and they sly, you know, and they can make you think that, you know, that, and then slip, you know, sneak up on you. I mean, he talked. That was the, you know, when he was at the Goldwater Johnson campaign in 1964. So and when it came to politics, man, his position was independent, an independent Black political party, and in my play that I wrote, he said Black led, and Martin Luther King said, I'm glad you said Black led and not just Black, so other people can join. Brother Malcolm said, yeah, other people can join, but it's always going to be led by Black folks, you know. So if somebody else wanted to join a Black led independent political party, cool with him. But they had to be, the leadership had to be Black people, you know. But that was his position on that, you know, that they'd have an independent Black political party that was able to go any way that we thought was good for our interests, not the interests of the Democrats or the Republicans.
Well, and thank you so much. And in this next half hour, we're going to talk a little bit more about Brother Malcolm, the Pan-Africanist, as well as the lessons learned and the next phase of what you feel what life could be if we had an opportunity to have Brother Malcolm's vision. But again, I want to thank you so much for joining us. You've provided so much very valuable information.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Legacy. Thank you.